Afra, let me hold you right there, because that is the point. It's 25 minutes away from the top of the hour. And that is precisely why I started the conversation by asking you, why should we be listening to this man? Because regardless of what is put out there, when you listen to the other points he makes on the side, there's a big headline, Duprey, I will pay for everything. But when you look at one of the statements he made, for instance, to show you that he's trying to get this back in the fire sale cheap, because he said CLF rescue could not have cost 20 billion TT dollars because, unlike many of the other rescues, these assets suffered a temporary diminution in value directly as a result of a global economic crisis. Other global rescues, he argues, were largely the result of bad investments in uncoverable subprime mortgages. He's finding ways to justify that even if you ran up a bill since you did the takeover, is because of your bad decisions.
Well, this is the other thing, that in fact there could be some correct points being made there by Mr. Duprey. I advanced the point about the interest rate for the public funds advanced as a way to protect the public interest. We must keep uppermost in terms of our discussion here the notion that public money is to be managed and accounted for to a higher standard than private money. We have to keep that uppermost in our minds. And at that point, we get the correct bearings to have the discussion. To move to your point now, Rennie, about the actual bailout being mismanaged. What we have here is all the ingredients for a very corrupt and improper set of arrangements. What we had was this. We had the atmosphere of a crisis. We had confusion, and we had conflicting versions. We had a strong political contest. All the systems of accountability and transparency were, and I'm going to say this clearly, were deliberately dismantled. They were deliberately dismantled. CL Financial had group audited accounts up until the 31st of December 2007. From the instant the government took over, there have been no group financial audits. Okay? I could go further. Those directors in CL Financial ought to have been required to complete the declarations for the Integrity Commission like directors in any other state-controlled company in this country. They have not been required to do so. The Integrity Commission is observing, I need to print already on this and I'll say it on the air, the Integrity Commission is observing what we call willful blindness. I hope some of you are listening, Integrity Commissioners. And lastly, we have a situation where the tenets of the Freedom of Information Act are effectively being ignored because, in fact, although I applied and I obtained a High Court judgment on the 22nd of July last year, awarding me the right to have all of those details published in terms of how the bailout was conducted, the Ministry of Finance has in fact filed an appeal, which to this moment remains in place. Although I'm in discussions with Minister Imbert and the discussions are fairly constructive, that appeal remains in place. So the very notion that information is something that we have a right to has been strongly challenged in court by me, and the government has responded just as strongly.
You just
so
took
we're in a serious fight here.
You just took it back to 2007. It brings a question for me. Is there a statute of limitation on this and corporate bodies from then being called to yield now? Is there being called to account? Is there a statute of limitation, and if so, what is it?
I don't know what it is. I mean, there's a general rule in terms of lawsuits. We saw it. It became visible, Rennie, during that, as the Limitations Act. It became visible during the lawsuits on e-tech, in which the previous administration, under Attorney General Anand Ramlogan, brought lawsuits against certain state enterprises which had been run by key P&M operatives. So in fact, lawsuits were launched against the UTT and E-Tech, which were both chaired by Professor Ken Julian, and a lawsuit was launched against Pt.3, which was chaired by Malcolm Jones. And in the E-Tech lawsuit, one of the big issues, in fact the biggest single issue at trial, was the fact that 4 years had passed. And the case was made that 4 years having passed, the Limitations Act would come into effect and that no further lawsuits would be possible. And the government took the point, it's a very interesting point, the government took the point in the E-Tech case that in fact, because the company was a state enterprise, and because the people appointed as the chiefs in a state enterprise of that prominence are people who enjoy political favor, and even if the company has suffered some kind of an improper thing or something that's questionable or something that in the normal circumstances you could sue, the fact of the matter is our political administration is not going to sue its political operatives. Therefore, the only time at which a lawsuit could in reality arise is when there's a change in political administrations. So in fact, I'm just walking through the argument. So in fact, the alleged negligent investment was made in 2005. Under the 4-year rule, the time for lawsuits would have ended in 2009. However, Mr. Manning didn't lose the election. The PNM didn't lose the election until May of 2010. The UNCPP took the point that, in fact, you had to wait for us to win the election to bring a lawsuit against these people. Which, in fact, means, Rennie, because they've won that point, the appeal court upheld that point of view, what I've just outlined. So, in fact, the appeal court has upheld the notion that a state enterprise, which is a politically constructed body in terms of its appointments, a state enterprise could sometimes not be subject to the Limitation Act. And in fact, you could have a Limitation Act that stretches forward into the future. What that means is that, in fact, I know that the Julian board, Ken Julian and his colleagues, have taken the case to the Privy Council. What that means is that, in fact, that notion of the too much time having passed is now a notion that is questionable, particularly when you're dealing with a state enterprise. Because one of the things we have to deal with, and it is inescapable, is the fact that CL Financial is a state-controlled enterprise. It is a public authority. They don't want to deal with it because there are implications that come with it. That's why they left Lawrence with the shares. But in fact, it is
a very useful.
And this is really now linking back into the limitation case.
A very useful precedent.
Yes.
Very useful indeed. It's 17, make that 18 minutes away from the top of the hour. We're going to take a break. We have spent some time talking about CLF financing, and I think we've gone as far as we want to go with that, because in the time I have with Afra this morning, I've got to go into something that happened before the Joint Select Committee last week. They were talking about accountability, and some of the things that came up were amazing, from the High Commission in London to Toronto to Ottawa to Belize, to Brazil, I'm sorry. And we have we have an Auditor General that's saying, I don't have these things. Well, I've got some questions on that I would see clarity from you on when we come back inside Brunch. Let's continue our discussion with Afra Raymond. And Afra, we left dealing with CLF, but we're going to leave CLF right there. I am disturbed at the Joint Select Committee hearing that took place last week. And I don't really want to go into the details of what happened at the embassies. I want instead to deal with, in response to a matter raised by MP Marlene McDonald, and she brought it clear, stating that in London, Costa Rica, New Delhi, Ottawa, even the High Commission in London documents not produced for passport register, emergency passports, cancelled passports, have a situation in Toronto where checks and balances over blank checks is not in place. She goes on to say the High Commission in Ottawa and Brazil, internal control is still lacking. These things were not brought to the Auditor General. That to me is disturbing, because in inquiring of other embassies and consulates, at least from the Caribbean, I am told that auditors are sent from the Home Office, i.e. the IRS or any government agency. Auditors are sent out to the embassies and consulates to look at the books and report. I get the feeling this does not obtain here. You have any information on that?
No, I don't know anything about the foreign affairs component of the discussion, Rennie. It certainly seems that there's a long-standing tradition of poor accountability.
Well, let us leave the international there as a statement of note, but let us bring it right home then. The ministry is here. What is the accountability situation there? I know the minute I raised that with you, you said, yeah, it's not just out there, it's here too.
Yep. So the point is that they have a lot of ministries that when you examine the Auditor General's report, that the standards of accountability, the civil service regulations are broken many, many times. For example, I could see in relation to the Auditor General's report, I have it on my screen here, where they're talking about the office of the president, which is the highest office in the country. And there's a situation where I think it was something like 86 items of expenditure were incorrectly classified. I don't know who's working at the president's office. That is not to suggest, it's on the first page, 85 instances of incorrect classifications of expenditure, $2.6 million in contravention of financial regulations. Could you imagine that? In contravention of financial regulations.
In the president's office.
In the president's office. Yes. And that's just one, that's the first chapter that's hitting you. And you could go on, there's there's judiciary. The judiciary has a figure of $49 point something million as unpresented checks not verified. Those are sorts of things that I couldn't imagine running a private company, that one could get away with that kind of thing if one was working in a private company that was properly administered. And it's happening with public money. So I return to my earlier principle that in fact public money needs to be handled and accounted for at a higher standard than private money. The big thing that's burning at me from these pages is in fact the question of accountability and consequences.